Good morning. Now, today we're going to talk about some pretty cool stuff. We're going to talk about gender. We're going to talk about what does it mean to be a man, right? Well, a woman. Of course, I know a little bit more about the first one, but what does it mean to be a man? What does it mean to be a woman? And so clearly, there's a lot of things affecting such a simple thing. And of course, what does it mean to be a man is sort of also implying what behaviors are appropriate for men to exhibit and what behaviors are appropriate, so we could talk about gender roles, potentially, all kinds of issues. Clearly, this question, what does it mean to be a man or a woman, is subject to huge cultural pushes, huge cultural influences. Even in the United States, I can tell you that I'm I'm a progressive man, right? Fact is, though, I grew up watching my grandfather, and my grandfather's idea of being a man was very straightforward. A man's job is to go to work, come home, bring home the money. The man's job is to sit at the head of the table. The man's job is never to touch a dirty dish after dinner. A man's job is, to take care of the household. Okay? So, given that kind of a role model that I had growing up, it's pretty clear that I must have at least some of that more traditional style of thinking. But you know what? Things do change. So we can talk about gender as far as the state of being male or female, and we could talk about this in terms of chromosomes, right? So potentially, you know that each and every cell in the human body has 46 chromosomes in 23 pairs. And of these 23 pairs of chromosomes, 22 pairs are matched, right? Mom gives you one, dad gives you one, and then they're matched in some ways. But the 23rd pair is a little bit odd, and that's what they call the sex chromosome. And what happens is that females have two what they call X chromosomes at that 23rd pair, whereas males have an X and a Y. Okay, so what happens is that when a gamete, by the way, is an egg cell or a sperm cell. When a gamete is produced, women's gametes, I guess, eggs. Women's eggs, by definition, must have an X chromosome. They must. There is no other option because, of course, the woman has two X's. The man's, however, can contain an X or a Y. Okay, and so if the man contributes the X, then the offspring becomes XX, and traditionally we'll talk about some exceptions, but generally speaking, this baby will develop into a female, and if the father contributes the Y, then into a male. Ironically, throughout history, it's always women that have been to blame. If women don't bear sons, then there's something wrong with them. And it's like, yeah, but it was the father's chromosome that really determines, the gender of the baby. And so, forward thinking, you're like, okay, maybe Henry VIII shouldn't have chopped off his wives' heads, right? Because it was his fault. But don't get too fast, because it turns out that a woman's body has the ability to selectively choose which sperm they do and do not accept. So, in some ways, women can control the process. So maybe King Henry VIII was right. Okay, so turns out though that associated with gender, there's gender stereotypes, as we said. They change with time. And again, in my grandfather's generation, one of the biggest stereotypes was men don't show emotions, right? A man's job is to be solid. You can count on this guy. He is not going to be laughing, giggling, crying. Big boys don't cry, etc. All right, some of the gender stereotypes. Just like all stereotypes, there's a lot of variability, and I don't have the image here, but I knew I drew it somewhere, and I don't remember which topic I drew it in. But if you recall, we talked about, a stereotype is like, here's a group average, and the stereotype is a center, and, males are here and females are here, but since there's so much variability within males and females, there's all kinds of overlap. But that does not change the fact that the stereotype is true. And I mean, I'll throw a stereotype out there. Men are physically stronger than women. I'm sorry, okay? And that is to say the average male is in fact stronger than the average female, but there are plenty of males that fall below the females and plenty of females that fall above into the male. Hopefully you get the idea. Yes, we are. In the past, there was much more of a view of a dichotomy. Dichotomy is just a fancy word for two. In other words, on versus off, strong versus weak, something like this. And instead, we're much more likely to say stronger or something of this nature. Yeah, less rigid between these two. Absolutely. Again, you wouldn't have to go all that far back to find women that wore pants in public to be scandalous, right? So clearly, you're out there, and things have changed. So what we find, though, in many parts of the world is androcentrism. That's a funky term right there. The belief that the male is the norm. Okay, the male way, and of course, this is most noticeable when, and it's changing, it is changing, but still there's a whole lot of it left, that he is used to imply all human beings, right? And so clearly we're moving away from that. But the ironic thing, opposite to androcentrism, is that in a really weird fashion, all fetuses, when they start developing, are female. Okay? They're female, they're female, they're female. A fetus will only become male if a particular hormone is introduced into the developing fetus at a particular point, and this hormone will basically kill the female reproductive system. But by default, all fetuses are born are developing at the beginning of development come out as female. So here's some interesting stereotypes. Now, these are, I already said some stereotyped male behavior, right, in traditional senses is unemotional or something like that. But what some researchers did, and this is cross-cultural, so this is very powerful because we talk about these stereotypes, and we wonder how much of these gender stereotypes are in fact based on cultural norms and current trends, and how much are based on actual reality, real biology. So some cross-cultural psychologists, they went out to a bunch of different cultures around the world, and they got like 500 adjectives. And they took each adjective and they say, is this a male word or a female word? Okay, so they had people identify them based on this maleness versus femaleness. And then what they did was they put together a consensus, basically, and I can't remember the exact way they did it, but it was basically 75% of people, if 75% of people within a single culture agreed that a particular adjective belonged to one gender, then they called it that. And then if 75% of the cultures studied, and I think there was like 25 or 30, something like that. If 75% or more agreed, then, and so all of a sudden this word, for example, adventurous, that means if you went to an American sample, 75% or more would say, yes, adventurous belongs to males. And if you went to different cultures around the world, 75% or more would have reached that same level of agreement. Okay, and so you find that some of the words associated with males are, in fact, I don't know, desirable perhaps, like ambitious and energetic, for example. Okay, but you know what? Males own some other ones too, such as reckless and what does it say? Oh, that's what it says. Boastful, egotistical, disorderly. Okay, and so that's interesting. By the way, having had a son and a daughter, I can tell you, and a husband and a wife, that whole disorderly thing that seems a little bit, at least in my household. Okay, well, at the same time, there was words that came out as female words, or BTW. I didn't necessarily say it. These were male words. These were the ones that came out for men. These are the ones that came out for women. And so women have their own: sentimental, submissive, weak, sexy, kind. I can't even read all of those things. And so it's an interesting idea, but it definitely points out, and this is critically important, that these gender stereotypes, yeah, I mean, there's definitely cultural influences on them, but there is a real difference between being male and being female. It is biologically rooted, and we should not pretend that it does not exist. It does. It does. Embrace it. Okay. Now, I know the problem is that the way the modern world is created, these gender role stereotypes, like aggressive, for example, are often the way to move up the corporate ladder. Okay? These gender role stereotypes, which are powerful, powerful things to have, don't really match up with the modern. It turns out that males are more likely to be bragging and going to the boss saying, "Look at how awesome I am." Okay, women are more likely to kind of quietly sit back, help their coworkers, when their coworkers are having problems, becomes a team player. And it's great. It's an incredibly important skill. But unfortunately, our modern industry, business, whatever, tends to reward this type of behavior and not reward this type of behavior. And I'm sorry, I think that what women offer is incredibly important to every business. The support of, to work together, to build teams. These are hugely important and undervalued. And I'm sorry, don't try to change these stereotypes. Try to change the system to recognize how both types of behaviors are in fact quite valuable. All right. So in overall intelligence, there doesn't seem to be, let's just say, some kind of a group average in intelligence. But there is, in fact, actually a fairly large difference in intelligence. It turns out that even though the average male and the average female about on top of each other, about IQ 100 or something. But it turns out at the extremes, extreme high intelligence and extreme low intelligence, there's far more males. Okay, females are more likely to be kind of clustered in towards the center there, whereas males are the extremes are more likely to be male. How about that? There's small differences in verbal abilities. You can imagine who's got the advantage there. There is some differences in mathematical, yeah, not math per se, but spatial abilities. Okay, and we'll put that somewhere. I'm gonna have I have an image somewhere for it. But things like mental rotation, males tend to have a much higher advantage of mental manipulation or envisioning positions on a map or something of this nature. But in actual math, like in an academic setting, no, there is none. Okay, there is no difference in math per se. However, the problem is that you see what we have here is the SAT scores. You see what we've got here is on the left side math scores on national test for fourth graders. Okay, so we see number one as a positive. Math scores for fourth graders have been improving across time, but we see that there's almost no difference between males and females there. But by the time they get to the SAT up in, at the end of high school, look at this distinction between the male scores and the female scores on the this is the math part, okay? And it's there, it's huge, okay? So where does it come from? Well, it turns out that it's let me see, what do I have here? No, I thought I had that slide somewhere. Okay. Well, it turns out that male brains and female brains do in fact develop differently. Different areas develop at different rates. And I mean, this goes back to ancestral caveman times when growing up, children needed different skills at different points in their life, right? And so it turns out that male brains tend to develop more of a spatially oriented or mathematically oriented readiness, for example. The brain is very plastic. I don't have a lot of, but plasticity is a funky word that means that the brain is responsive to the environment and will change in response to the experiences it receives. Okay. Well, it turns out that the brain of males is particularly receptive earlier to mathematical things. And so what happens is, in a simple sense, women's brains will be completely at that point too, but not until later. Okay, so boys, when they're 7, 8 years old, their brains are at that point where they're malleable, where they're like ready to receive mathematical skills. And so what basically happens is in second, third, fourth, fifth grade, boys start to get smiley faces, whereas girls start to get, right, combine that with the cultural stereotypes, and then all of a sudden, at some point, 8th, ninth, 10th grade, all of a sudden it's no longer one size fits all math. It's like, choose what you're going to do. Not every kid takes calculus, right? And so what's going to happen is, I mean, this is just simple principles of learning. If you did something, math, and you got smiley faces, now you feel good about math and you're more likely to pursue math. And so all of a sudden, the early positive experiences that the males had turn into selection for more math courses later on. And of course, as we said, the reason for this is because male brains are just so in a lot of European countries they divide genders. They put them into different classrooms because they recognize that an education should not be one size fits all, okay? That the developing children have different needs at different stages of development. So if you go to Europe and you look at their equivalent to the SAT, I don't know what they take, you don't see this division here. You just don't see this gender difference. So this is a product of the American educational system in a lot of ways. Um, Turns out that women tend to score a little lower on self-esteem, which is because men are more arrogant, right? We know that. Males are clearly more physically aggressive, but when it talk about relational aggression, women dominate. So if you look at overall aggression, males and females are close to each other. Emotional expression, it turns out that women are not only more outwardly expressive, but they're better at reading others' emotions as well. Okay? But when it comes to the actual experience of emotions, there doesn't seem to be any gender differences. So even though my grandfather never smiled, doesn't mean he wasn't happy, right? He had the same experience of emotions, just was socialized to believe he should never. Okay, and then obviously talkativeness. Yes. Okay. Um, Overall, there doesn't seem to be differences. Again, if you take like the total average as far as psychological disorders goes, but absolutely you find a large distinction with females having depression far more often. You find the genders having schizophrenia equally commonly, but males having it much more severely. You find that in what do you call it? Autism spectrum is again it's somewhat equally experienced by males and females, but more severely by males. Okay. So overall, men and women are more similar than they are different, but it doesn't change the fact that they are different. Yeah, clearly gender differences are based on natural selection. Of course, I mean, in our ancestral past, I mean, women's role was to stay and protect the children. Men's role was to go out and find food. So clearly, our brains evolved. Male and female brains are the product of different evolutionary selection. All right, they really are. I mean, a successful female needs different cognitive skills than a successful male. They really did. So there's different evolutionary selection, therefore creating different. As we see, there's cross-cultural studies, and if you're finding the same differences from one culture to another, it's pretty straightforward. And yeah, you can't test this empirically, but still. Here is an actual, this is hilarious, an actual physical difference between males and females. And it's the ratio of finger lengths, all right? And so it turns out that males have, and I mean, you can read this, but the index finger relative to the ring finger, etc. And females have, was it the opposite? I think it was. I can't see that little itty bitty thing. I think it's the opposite. But anyway, it's very kind of fascinating because we'll talk about it in the next chapter. That next topic, that homosexual males and females fall in between typical male and typical female, and it's really kind of crazy. But these are gender. These are just some kind of physical averages. But the fact is, for whatever reason, this difference emerges. So there's clearly some difference between male and female. I find this one. This is the one that I was thinking about here. No, I don't have it here, but I have it in my brain. So here I go. There's clearly differences in brain functioning. Males, cerebral specialization. Basically, what happens is pretty much any task you're talking about, reading, doing math, watching a video, it doesn't matter. When males do something, one area of their brain tends to light up with activity. Okay, activity is focused. In females, again, generally, these are, again, averages. Females, when they do an activity, much more likely to have moderate level activity kind of across the entire cortex, okay? So males focus one area, females see the whole picture, perhaps, okay? Um, Females seem to have a larger corpus callosum. The corpus callosum is a band of tissue that connects the left and the right hemisphere. That's not completely true. Um, Clearly these differences will emerge. In fact, this is actually pretty interesting. Let's say I'm going to just do a cool thought experiment. It turns out that in the brains of rats, okay, let's look at rat brains, okay, rat males and rat females. What happens is that they have different neurons that respond to different things, okay? So that if a male rat and a female rat are looking at the exact same image, then different patterns of neural activity will occur. Okay, that's just a statement. Now imagine this kind of a thought experiment. You could imagine you could take the brain of a male rat and the brain of a female rat and somehow transplant them into some kind of a clone. Okay, so you've got the exact same body. The only difference is just these two brains. Now you expose these animals to the exact same environmental experiences. Okay, so they've got everything is the same, the same, the same. But you know what's going to happen is that when the rats get exposed to an environmental object, even though they're being exposed to the exact same object, the male rat's brain will respond in one way, the female rat's brain will respond in another, and because the brains are plastic, the brains will change in response to experiences. So despite having exactly the same environmental experiences, very, very quickly, those rats will diverge from each other. Okay? So there is something to be said about hormones, as already I had mentioned. At some stage, somewhere around 3 months, when a fetus is developing, that's where this differentiation begins to occur. I guess it must be earlier. But anyway, as we said, all females are all fetuses start developing as females and only become males if a particular hormone is present. If that hormone is present, some form of an androgen, I don't remember which one. But if that hormone is not present, then the body will continue to develop as a female. Okay, so clearly hormones have a huge impact right there, just on the development of external genital systems. Um, so prenatal hormones, clearly look at this. Mothers were given a particular drug, androgen-like. Androgens are hormones related to testosterone, so they're male typical hormones. And so they were given these mothers were given this hormone to prevent miscarriage. And then all of a sudden, what happened was that the girls that were born from these pregnancies exhibited more male typical behaviors. Okay, so I was like, okay, very interesting. Clearly, testosterone is the hormone that is necessary for the onset of puberty in males, and testosterone seems to be responsible for much of the male typical behaviors. Oh, here's the one. Androgens, and turning out that you see this image on the left, and the question is, are these two the same, right? And so it's a mental rotation. So we do this kind of a thing. Males have an advantage over females on this task, but females that have been given testosterone supplements or older males that receive testosterone supplements subsequently perform better on the task. And it's the same thing on the right. If I tip the glass, what's it going to look like, kind of a thing. Okay? All right. So, yes, clearly there is some biology. There's absolutely some truth to that. But, there is a truth. We do socialize our children. We dump gender roles on them. I still remember. Yeah, I still remember. I mean, my brother. He's an asshole. Oh my God! And I still remember when my nephew was a little kid, and we were somewhere. I don't know where it was. And my nephew picks up a doll and is playing with it. And my brother just got furious and he couldn't fly across the room fast enough to smack that doll out of his son's hand. It's just Absolutely. And so yeah, my nephew was taught very quickly. I mean, this isn't just socialization. This is principles of, the law of effect, or, basic operant conditioning. If a behavior, playing with dolls, is followed by pain, dad just smacked me, guess what? I'm not going to play with dolls again. Okay? And so a lot of what we do, though, we learn in either very specific in learning situations like this, or again, more socialization. Because it turns out that, of course, when my kids were little, they used to love watching, like the Disney Channel or Nicktoons or something. I don't know what it was, but they would have all kinds of crazy commercials on those channels, and it was pretty clear they were those commercials were very targeted. Okay, there was very few commercials that were designed for all children. Right? They knew which kids wanted. No, they were. Well, that's the problem. Did they know which kids wanted which toys, or were they creating markets for different toys? But clearly, those commercials were telling the children, if you're a boy, this is what you're supposed to play with. If you're a girl, this is what you're supposed to play with. Clearly, parents are one of the most important in any stage of development in a child. But parents select books for children that basically set up what we want them to. But at the same time, I mean, I don't know. I mean, it is true. When my son was little, we had a lot of truck books and airplane books and things like this. Um, and then when my daughter was little, we ended up with a lot of princess books. But I'm not sure how much of that was the kids selecting it and how much it was me imposing it on the kids. But I bet you there was some of each. There was some of each. Okay. Clearly, peers are incredibly important. Um, I'll tell you, it's crazy how important peers are. Here's a off the wall example. They found a group of kids that wouldn't eat broccoli, and it's not hard to find kids that won't eat broccoli. Okay, they won't touch this stuff. Well, what they did was basically the parents tried to get them to eat broccoli, eat broccoli, eat broccoli, eat broccoli. He's like, no, 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 no. Okay, I'll give you $1,000 if you just eat one bite of broccoli. Kid's like, no, no, I'll give you 5 candy bars. No, no. So you take these kids, they're like 4 years old, and what you do is you put them in a room with other children that are eating broccoli. Because yes, some children really do love broccoli. So you've got a table full of these random 4-year-olds eating broccoli. You put the 4-year-old down that won't touch it, and the 4-year-old looks around and eats the broccoli. And it's like, wait a minute, wait a minute. Mom and dad, who took care of you from the day you were born and have paid for everything that you have, you won't listen to them. But some random 4-year-olds that you've never seen in your life can change your behavior? Well, that's crazy, man. And so, whatever a 4-year-old or 6-year-old's peers are doing is what they're going to do. So, clearly, there's something there. Textbooks often contain gender bias, yes, and teachers definitely still treat boys and girls differently. But I think what's actually an unspoken thing that when it comes to the influence of schools is that what happens is children need role models. They really do. They need some adult to look up to, a same gender adult to look up to define what their role is as. And it turns out that unfortunately there's a lot of single parent families in America, and most single parent families are in fact female, mom headed families. And so what we find is that children, as they're growing up, there's many, many, many males that just have no role model to look to. They just have no one to look to. There's no dad. And then they go to school and none of their teachers, well, I I don't see any teachers in my kids' elementary schools. Maybe the world is changing. But at the elementary school level, you don't find male teachers, generally speaking. And so all of a sudden, these boys have nobody to look up to. And so they start looking and idolizing people like Des Bryant and saying, oh, that's the way a male is supposed to. No, that is not how a male is supposed to behave. So it's a kind of a difficult and troubling thing. What schools do is they create a role model, right? The teachers are a role model for the girls, but the boys don't have that equivalent thing. Here it is. I knew it. Okay, there it is. I talked that story. All right, here's a crazy story. There's a kid here. His name was David Reimer, and what happened was after he was born, I think David was a pair of twins, right? There was two twin boys. Two boys? I can't remember. Well, anyway, David goes in for his circumcision, right? You know, the circumcision. And some kind of accident happened, and instead of circumcising, the whole penis is gone. Okay? So what happens is mom is freaked out. What am I going to do? And so there was this psychologist at the time, Dr. Money, who was had this current fad, this belief that gender was all the product of society. That there was just nothing to do with biology. And so what happened was Dr. Money convinced David's mom, although they changed the name, to raise her, whatever, as a girl. And so they raised David as a girl. I don't remember her female name, but she had a girl's name. And she was not told at all about the boy thing. Okay? She was put in the dresses. She was given, all of the stereotypical girls' toys, etc. But even from an early age, this child was just drawn to the trucks and was etc. and was etc. And then look at that, around 14, he's just like, there's something not right. What is going on? Okay? And so at 14, he says, I'm not going to do this anymore. And his parents told him his medical history, and all of a sudden, he just couldn't. He just could not become a girl. No matter how much they treated him like it, the biology ultimately emerged. So clearly, if it comes to the question of nature versus nurture, it feels to me that nature is probably more important. But I really like this on the question of nature versus nurture, because what we've got here, this is crazy, okay? You've got these worms. I love these worms. Oceanox francpresi. They're an ocean worm. And what happens is they live in the ocean, and they only live on one very specific place, and that is the carcasses of dead whales. Okay, they live in whale bones. And so what happens is that when eggs are released, okay, new eggs, they float up and then they float down to the whalebone. If the egg falls onto the whalebone, then it develops into a female. But if it falls down and falls on top of another female, then it develops into a male. It gets absorbed into the female and becomes male. The male on the left here, like a little Rice Krispie, is nothing but a sperm sac. That's it. It has no existence other than that. And so this creature, when it's first, conceived, is absolutely flexible. It can become male, it can become female. It depends completely on the environment, right? Unlike David Reimer, okay, the gender on this worm is in fact 100% flexible based on environment that it gets exposed to. All right, there's not just gender stereotypes, but there's role expectations, and I'd like to pretend that these are a thing of the past, but they're not. I'm sorry. I like to pretend I'm progressive, but a male's job, a man's job is to take care of his family. A man's job. In fact, I can still remember the first day that I became a man. Okay, I was how old was I? I was wow. I was even older. I was 32 years old, and it was Thanksgiving, and I had just purchased my own house, my first house. I had just purchased my own dining table, and it was Thanksgiving, and we had other family over, and I sat at the head of my table, and I was the host of the Thanksgiving dinner that I purchased with my work and my income. And I was like, okay, that was it. That was the day I became a man, right? The day I knew I was no longer a kid. And so 32 years old, but still, the point is, it was really a very conservative moment, okay? What I define as being male. I finally fulfilled my role obligations. Clearly, this becomes problematic because when females lose their job, it's often viewed as if mothers lose their job in a family, it's often viewed as an inconvenience. If a father loses his job, it's viewed as critical. And it shouldn't be, right? I mean, why not? But I mean, do you know why I live in Texas? Because I had a job in Texas. Never once considered whether or not we should move from my wife's work. Isn't going to happen. Okay. Why did we live in the state before this one? My job. What about the one before? My job. And so I'm sorry I'm a sexist pig, but the fact is that's just the way it was, right? So it really is an interesting dilemma to have these roles. Role expectations for females in marriage mandate. Yeah, there's more stigma attached to women that are unmarried than men that are unmarried. In fact, in China, there's a very specific word for women that are about 25 or above and not yet married, and they call them leftover women. Right? Hey, I'm not making it up here. Talk about a stigma, but there is no similar thing for unmarried males at that age. So clearly there's something there. Women are supposed to be child centered. A good mom is supposed to be, okay? And so, again, roles are changing, but again, for a generation at least, it was expected that women were supposed to both go out, get a job, and fulfill the roles of a traditional mother. And again, these are changing, but in my house, we bucked the rules a little bit, and I basically picked up the kids from school every day. No big deal, right? Except I'm going to tell you, in 100 people over there, there's usually about 2 males and 98 females. That's pretty much a ratio of male to female picking up children. Now, again, it's been a few years since I've been in that situation, but it means it hasn't died, okay? It isn't gone. Uh, Female role, yeah, diminished career aspirations. Yeah, it is. I find it kind of problematic. We saw in some a family that my that I know, Korean family, right? Very traditional. The father worked, the mother stayed at home, took care of the kids, but the mother had such a motherhood mandate that she devoted her life to these children. I mean, it was like crazy. She would, every single day, she would hand deliver fresh lunch to both children, so that they would have not just a homemade meal, but a very freshly made, warm, new. And it was like, what? Now both of her children are off to college. She's drifting. She has no purpose in life anymore. She can't even imagine what she's supposed to do with her life. She's got nothing. I'm sorry for her husband, because now, what's he got? What can he do with this? Okay? And so it was wonderful for those kids growing up, although in my opinion, she spoiled those children and created unrealistic expectations. But whatever, I'm not getting there. So, diminished career aspirations, right? Clearly, at least for this woman. Multiple roles, yeah. And again, though, that's changing, because at least in my house, I took on an awful lot of the typical female roles. Okay, so I don't know. Okay, so gender role identity. Yeah. Turns out that just because you're XX or XY doesn't necessarily mean you're going to identify with male or female. And so gender role identity is independent of what your actual chromosomal structure is. And this is not to do with homosexuality here. This is different. And so we find that research indicates people with more traditional gender roles are less adjusted than those who are more traditional. Oh, less, right. Okay, I read it. So we could talk about androgynous, undifferentiated, all kinds of different combinations. Yeah. Androgyny is a coexistence, and again, this is in the next topic is going to be on sexuality. So this is independent of sexuality. Androgyny is the existence of male and female traits within a single person. Um, Androgynous individuals tend to be more flexible, tend to be able to roll more, and I mean, hopefully the move to the future is more towards androgyny. Um, in my home, having raising my children here, we very much had an interesting idea whose role was which, and sometimes things did match each other. Like, say for example, whose job is it to take out the trash? Mine. Why? Well, it does involve some heavy lifting, and so I do have some advantages over her. And so some of our gender roles, or some of our roles rather, did fall along traditional gender lines. But again, like I said, here I was picking up the children after work because it's just or after school rather, because it was something I was able to do. And so we basically we divided up the chores not based on traditional gender roles, but more based on what we can get away with. What is this? Oh, poof. Yeah, blah blah blah. We did communication stuff earlier. Hints for men. Don't interrupt others. Don't respond with grunts. I love this. This is cute. All right. And women. All right. Make eye contact. All right. Assert yourself. Okay. So we'll stop there. And the next, as I said, the next topic is a natural extension on this because it's not gender per se, but sexuality. And so clearly, gender and sexuality have a lot of overlap in their discussions.